LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains descriptions of child sex abuse, sexual assault, self-harm, and violent crime. Please listen with care.
A man tied up the parents, grabbed this young girl, 10 or 12 years of age, sexually assaulted her over a number of hours in the home and within the hearing of the parents, and then had left the house.
He's been at the centre of some of Australia's most confronting criminal cases, from the infamous Mr. Cruel attacks to a terrifying siege at a Melbourne kindergarten where 4 children were doused in petrol and held hostage.
The scene was a very small room with one adult, a number of small children, and his canister of petrol.
Associate Professor David Wells is one of the country's most experienced forensic physicians. For decades, he stood at the intersection of medicine and justice, examining and interviewing countless traumatised victims and delivering expert evidence in courtrooms across the world.
In these situations, you see the best and the worst of human behaviours.
In this episode, he takes us inside the reality of forensic medicine, what it means to work with police, to read the body for clues, and to speak for those who can't speak for themselves.
They're one of the little highs you get. There's not a lot in this job, but they're one of the events that just give you that warm feeling that maybe there is someone who's monitoring all of this.
My name's Liz Porter. I'm a journalist, true crime author, and forensic science obsessive. I've spent my career uncovering how forensic science cracks the toughest cases, writing 3 books on the subject and earning a PhD in the history of the Victoria Police Forensic Science Lab. Join me as I sit down with the world's top forensic experts and discover how forensic science is convicting the guilty and exonerating the innocent.
I was working in London, and part of the role of the gynecology registrar was to see any cases of rape or sexual assault that were reported. I saw the first of the victims of sexual assault in the emergency department, and I'll never forget it. It was a young woman who'd alleged she'd been sexually assaulted in the hours before she presented. And you can imagine a busy emergency department in one of the NHS hospitals. A very thin curtain separated you and your patient from the patients on either side. On one side was an elderly man who'd had a stroke and was clearly very distressed. On the other side was another person who was vomiting and calling out. And between all of this, and this young woman are wedged in there with zero privacy and me having to ask some very intimate questions about events. And I thought, surely as a profession we can do better than this. But here we were. If you were a victim of sexual violence, you were basically at the bottom of the food chain. You were confronted by surrounds and events that were beyond your control, much the same as the sexual assault itself, and the system provided absolutely no support. And that stuck in my mind a little bit because I subsequently came back to Australia, saw that things were slightly better, but I couldn't understand how some of society's most vulnerable individuals were ascribed to virtually no support at all in their moment of great need, and it just got me progressively intrigued. Later on, when I started in the field of forensic medicine, I was seeing a large number of children, particularly children who were sexually assaulted. 1 year in, I started to think that I hadn't been to court on too many of these cases. And again, it interested me that here were very vulnerable individuals whose cases never went very far in the system, and yet we espouse publicly the importance of reporting and of getting help.
So the job of a forensic physician involves dealing with sexual assault victims and assault victims of all ages, but it involves other things as well. Could you explain?
Yeah, I suppose, look, just to go back a little bit, forensic medicine is a very small subspecialty within the broader field of medicine. It involves the interface between medicine and the justice system, and in this case, the criminal justice system. So it involves where individuals are either alleged victims or perpetrators of offences, and where medical evidence might assist in understanding what could have occurred.
So I'd like to take you back to May 1989 when you were called to a suburban kindergarten in Melbourne. Can you tell us what you found when you got there?
Well, there's a little bit of a backstory to this. It didn't start as a siege, but rather a couple. The husband felt that his wife had been done a significant disservice by the public health system. He felt that she had either been wrongly diagnosed or wrongly treated and demanded compensation from the government. This wasn't forthcoming, and so he, his wife and his young child started a hunger strike on the steps of the Victorian Parliament. This went on for a considerable period of time and was monitored by police and other authorities. And I was particularly interested in the fact that this child was also being starved, if you like. And children are much more vulnerable to the aspects of starvation than adults. So some days in, a meeting was held with the parents, police and our office, and the decision was to remove the child from this situation against the parents' wishes. We felt that this child was at risk of serious or permanent harm. So as this protest went on, a sort of silent protest with husband and wife versus the government, it became increasingly obvious that the wife was developing quite a destructive mental illness. She was then assessed and hospitalised. So this left the father alone on the steps of Parliament. Apparently, he left the scene one day and returned with a can of petrol, and there was a threat of self-immolation. He then disappeared. The next stage of this unpleasant saga was that the father attended at a kindergarten in a Melbourne suburb, took 4 or 5 children as hostages and locked himself, the children, and his canister of petrol in a room and made threats that he would kill the children unless the authorities responded to his requests. And at that point, I was asked to attend because I'd had some previous contact with this situation.
And what was your read on him that morning?
Look, I don't know. I had to speak through the negotiator, a police negotiator. I didn't get a sense of the degree perhaps of his thinking or his thought processes, but it appeared through the voices that I could hear that he was very fixed on the idea that he should be compensated for these events of his wife, and that he was also very strong on the point that damage would follow if these weren't resolved. And
the children were in a very dangerous situation at that point. Could you explain exactly what might have happened?
So the scene was a very small room with, as I said, one adult and a number of small children. He had doused the children in petrol and had matches and was prepared to set a match alight, which would have resulted in a very significant explosion and likely death of all of the people within that room. So it was a very tense and confronting situation in the room because through the listening devices we could hear children crying, sobbing, and clearly very distressed indeed. On the outside, and the police had set this up as a very large crime scene, the parents had arrived. They were absolutely distraught, friends, family, staff of the kindergarten, and then all of the emergency services were in situ. And this went on for many hours.
And you had the members of the police special operations group very keen to go in?
Yeah, I mean, these are a highly trained group of individuals who have to think on their feet and think very quickly of the different situations. And I think the view was that at some stage, physical intervention would be required, and it would be needed to be done in a very, very rapid fashion. So you'd imagine a situation where this man has allegedly got matches, he's threatening to light a match. If that occurs, there would be complete destruction there and of anyone else nearby. And the parents, all of this. But the positive was that there was an open communication with the individual inside the room. Part of this also, the fire brigade had managed to put a sensing device, I think, just under the door, and they confirmed that there were very powerful presence of accelerants or petrol in the room. So that part of it was confirmed.
Now, you gave police advice that ultimately ended the siege. What exactly did you say to them and why?
It struck me as someone a little bit outside that, my responsibility is not so much to intervene urgently, but you're obliged to think of alternative solutions that may not require a physical intervention. I mean, that's not my skill set. And it was clear that this man needed to ventilate his frustrations publicly, and he mentioned a court hearing. So I suggested to police that we offer him an opportunity to give all of his information or evidence in an open court hearing where adjudicators could decide what might be an appropriate outcome. To do this, I needed to get the police on side, and I was fortunate to have an assistant commissioner of police there who also saw that police really had their backs to the wall because this was going to have a very bad outcome if the physical intervention occurred. And together we wrote him a letter saying that if he was prepared to release the children, no harm would come to him, and secondly, he would have his day in court. And again, this required the writing of a letter, the handing over of a letter, guarantees of this process. Again, some hours took place, and it was clear that these children were becoming more and more fragile, because remember that petrol poured onto skin can cause chemical burns, and these are painful injuries. The long and short of it was, after a little bit of more negotiating, he agreed to release the children and come out. And ultimately, this is what occurred. So the ambulance service was there, received each child, and these children were disfigured from the burns. Their skin was peeling off them. They were very distraught. But the whole service worked very professionally. Ambulance were excellent. Each child was removed, assessed, treatment commenced, and then transported to hospital. Very confronting for, even the senior police were knocked around by seeing how damaged these kids were and the level of distress. And with parents there as well, it was a very challenging moment. The outcome for the children was excellent. I mean, all of them went off to the Royal Children's Hospital, received treatment, and made excellent physical recoveries. The psychological impact, obviously, is a very separate one, and one that's probably still ongoing. The perpetrator of this was taken into police custody, and that was the end of the situation on that day.
But he did get his day in court, which is what you promised him?
He did. He was charged with some fairly serious events, and this was pre-terrorism type days, but the judge made some comment about this being a form of terrorist type of activity. Be it as it may, he got a very lengthy sentence. I understand he's been released. I've had no further contact with either he, his wife, or his child.
And when this man was handed the written promise of a court date, what were you thinking? Did you think it would work?
I didn't know. for me, my options are very limited. You can try and talk your way through situations, and I've been involved in a considerable number of sieges where particularly mental illness might have the background to the starting this process. And it's really a matter of looking at some common ground and talking your way through it in a non-threatening way. I didn't know whether it would work or not, but the alternative didn't bear thinking about. I've kept up with a couple of the children. I think we met 2 or 3 years ago just as a chat to see how things are. They're delightful young people with children of their own now. And, for me, it was an extraordinary moment. The policeman, the senior policeman who I was involved in, not the Deputy Commissioner, but another one, said to me later, and this brought me back down to earth, he said, if it had gone pear-shaped, you and I would never have been able to be seen in public again. There would have been so much vilification of why did you go down this pathway and not the other one. And he said, I think we went pretty close. No reason to doubt that.
Now, to take you to something else horrific and also involving children, but as we've said, this was your job in the 80s. You were working for Victoria Police because your job was called police surgeon rather than chief forensic physician. And you were the police surgeon during a spate of attacks that are perhaps the most notorious unsolved crimes in Australia. Could you describe your role during the Mr. Cruel investigation?
Yeah, this was an extraordinary chapter in Australian crime history. My first involvement commenced when the police telephoned me and said that a young girl had been sexually assaulted in her home. The background was that a man his face was covered, had come into a home in suburban Melbourne, had tied up or secured the parents, grabbed this young girl who from memory might have been in her, 10 or 12 years of age, maybe younger, had sexually assaulted her over a number of hours in the home and within the hearing of the parents, and then had left the house. And so my situation was I was asked to examine the child, particularly to see if there were any medical issues that needed to be addressed, and secondly, to collect any forensic evidence. At this point, we had no idea who the offender may have been, and secondly, we obviously had no idea that this behaviour was going to continue into the future. There are a few things around that case that I still recall. One was the enormous bravery, perhaps isn't the right word, but the positivity of the young girl involved. She was very connected, articulate, and had a resolve that made me feel positive about her future. And the second one was that the father and mother were devastated by what had occurred, but the father offered a solution that I suspect any parent might in these circumstances. He wanted to find this man and destroy him. He was very clear about that this man had destroyed his family and he owed that to his family. It's interesting when you think, well, that might be my response as well, but I have to dissuade him because this will be a counterproductive event. In my own clumsy way, I tried to explain to him that he may well achieve his aim, but then it would be him that spends the next decade or so in jail because of that response. And then there is truly a family destroyed as well. But I could understand the logic to it. And I often sit and wonder in that case and in others, how would I respond if I'd been put in this situation? I never sit in judgment of people on those sorts of things. It's a very personal and confronting process. So in that case, we knew very little about what was about to happen, but the assessment of this child involves, much like any medical assessment, a very careful understanding, developing a rapport with the child, with the parents, and the examination itself And then sitting on the edge of that is collecting specimens. And I suppose we have a little saying in forensic medicine, and that is the most important specimen is the one you forgot to take. And this rang very clearly to me because this was a very serious offence. And so I took a very large number of specimens, and as it turned out, one of those specimens gave the investigators some idea as to who might have, and I've used the word loosely, identify the alleged perpetrator. They needed, however, to find a perpetrator to confirm it first. It was not something that you could use on the streets or use as a wider thing, not a physical description of them.
And what was that evidence? Was it an unusual blood group or?
No, it's just something that might allow his genetic makeup to be identified.
Uh-huh.
But again, as I say, you need someone to compare it with first. So that was my first involvement in what subsequently became known as the Mr. Cruel cases. As it turned out, police felt that there may have been a number of preceding cases. And typically in these sorts of cases, the level of offence, the level of sophistication increases as the activity continues. So the first early cases, and these are often ones where the clues become much easier to identify, looked a little bit more amateurish, if you like. But again, the actual connection remains a little bit clouded.
And there were 3 victims of Mr. Cruel that you identified. The first attack was in the home, but the other 2 involved young girls who were taken away from the home. Is that right?
Yes.
And particularly with, I think, the third one, it was a long process of interviewing. When the victims are young and have experienced such trauma, are there any special things that you have to do that are different from the normal or usual interview with a victim of a sexual assault?
Look, I'd have to say these are very long processes. You're dealing not only with a child, but you're dealing with the parents, you're dealing with investigators, the media, and others. And it's a difficult situation because in the second case, this child was found on the streets, been released by the perpetrator, came to police attention and was immediately taken to hospital. I'll never forget the phone call I got that night. I wasn't on call, but the phone rang at 2 or 3 a.m. and the police said, "We've found the girl. We think she's another of this unknown offender's victims, and we're very keen that you examine her because you'd seen an earlier one." So I arrived at the Austin Hospital with this situation of a young girl by herself, or I think with a counsellor in a room, and her parents were there. Now, I'd met the parents a few days earlier because the police were very keen that they look at any background of this young girl and the family that might assist in identifying an offender.
Because she had disappeared.
She had disappeared. As part of this, they asked me to have a look at her diaries and her writing, which I must admit, teenage girls' writings, I'm not the parent of a teenage girl, but they're much more articulate, much more socially forward than the young boys I had awareness of. And reading her diaries and so on, I got a small insight into her, but meeting the parents, and I'll never forget, I think it must have been day 2 or day 3, things start to feel a little pessimistic when a young child's been gone for that long. In many cases, this has a terrible outcome. And I spent time talking with the parents and explaining that when she is found, this is the process that will happen. And one of them is they can't have any contact with her until my examination's completed because we do not need any contamination processes. And I went through all of this and I said, as soon as the examination's completed, you will be the next person to see her and you can hold her and do whatever you wish. And the father said to me, "Look, thank you very much, but we know she's gone." That devastating practicality of we think our daughter is dead. So I arrive at the hospital, the parents are in one room, this young child is in another room, and I have to spend probably 3 or 4 hours with her. next door are the parents, knowing that she's okay, but sobbing, upset. The police very, very emotional indeed. And that wonderful moment when you take this young girl out of the room and hand her over to her parents, everyone was in tears, myself included. It was just an emotional moment where someone's life who was thought to be ended was back and in safe custody. And they're one of the little highs you get. There's not a lot in this job, but they're one of the events that just give you that warm feeling that maybe there is someone who's monitoring all of this.
And the third victim, I think, certainly for years after that very long interaction of having to debrief her, you maintained contact with her, I think, over the years.
I have, yes. Yeah, I've stayed in contact with her father died, with her mother, and this young girl, an adult with a child of her own, and life is certainly a lot better now. It was interesting, she had an older sister who was at home at the time this man arrived. Her parents were out, and he took this younger girl, and this older sister was very troubled, and I think this haunted her for a long time, the fact that she could have done more, perhaps reacting like the father did in the first case, that I have a responsibility here. And secondly, why didn't he take me? It was that guilt. And it reinforces that process that these aren't isolated events. They do damage to everyone in the circle. It's ripple type effect. Often those secondary victims are more traumatised in some cases than others. We all have a very different makeup, if you like, that do this.
And of course, the usual investigative response is to work with some evidence, some forensic evidence. But in this case?
It's very limited. And I'm not privy to a lot of the police information because I think sometimes it helps to be a little bit separate from that because it allows your thinking to not go down a sort of preordained line. But yes, it gave rise to a lot of theories and some new methods of investigation. Part of that was, does this person know or is privy to a lot of forensic information? Because he either held these children or washed them repeatedly so that any, for instance, trace DNA would be removed from their skin. And it got us thinking a little bit, is it one of us? Might it be a police officer, a forensic scientist from here or from interstate, a medical person who either works or has worked in this field? Because the level of sophistication of removing this evidence was such that it smacked of that. The second issue was at some point in one or two of the cases, there was a suggestion that he may have a back injury. The way he handled the children, the way he positioned children, one could read between the lines that there might be a back injury of some kind. So these tiny little gems started to come to light. And there was a lot of requests to the public. It could be that a person next door, it could be someone you know. If you've got any thoughts at all, please tell us. The return on that was enormous. I mean, the response, thousands of people were nominated as potential suspects. Clearly, a massive amount of information. Every one of those leads needed to be followed up by the police. Just an enormous job. The second part was that if this person does have a medical problem, maybe their medical practitioner knows about it. So in concert with the Medical Practitioners Board, a request was made to medical practitioners, if you know of someone who you think could be a suspect, please let us know. Now, this is a new area because you're asking doctors to divulge confidential information. And the board were very supportive and constructive in this way. The argument is providing this information is likely to result in prevention of further very, very damaging acts of behaviour. And although it might breach the confidentiality, it is justified for the greater need of the public. And again, the medical profession were very supportive of this process, and a considerable number of people were reviewed. I'll just give you a brief anecdote on this. One day I was in a taxi and another car, the driver, cut us off. The taxi driver wound down the window and shouted something at the other person. And it was an unusual comment he made. It was a word that Mr. Krul had used in one of his cases. And it resonated with me that here is a word I haven't heard for a long time, but he had used it. And I was a bit confronted because might this be the person? So I got him to drop me off. I didn't get him to drop me at home. I didn't want that connection. I got him to drop me some distance from home. And I immediately rang the task force that were on this case, and I said, look, I told them that situation. I said, I've got his driver name and driver car number. It might be nothing, but it might be something. They rang me a couple of days later and said, look, really appreciative of what you gave. We looked him up. He looked like he might be a person of interest, so we knocked on his door. And he said he immediately started sweating, became very agitated. So we took him back to the police station and interviewed him. He had a very strong alibi, so he clearly wasn't the person they were interested in. But in the questioning process, he did admit to offences against children. Now, these were completely unrelated to the Mr. Krul case, but enough, I think, to charge him and convict him on other offences that have been occurring. So a small anecdote to what remains an unsolved offence.
And do you think that Mr. Krul would ever be identified after all these years?
As I don't know the answer to that. I mean, the investigation hasn't concluded. There are still people reviewing, looking independently of this cold crime cases, etc. It's possible that he might come to light while he's still alive or even after he has died. I simply don't know. He may have stopped this behaviour, which I think I don't know that he would. He may have died, he may have moved to another region, or he may be incapacitated in some way. But it's certainly a series of crimes that really did damage the innocence of a lot of people's lives.
Now, the frustrating thing about the investigation into Mr. Krul was this lack of traditional forensic evidence. In your daily life as a forensic physician, you dealt with cases where there was lots of evidence, specifically in child abuse or child assault. What were the most common forms of physical evidence you'd be looking at then?
You approach a case more around the human aspect. Are these people okay? What do we need to do right now and in the long term? And to me, they're the more crucial elements. I mean, as a medical practitioner, health and welfare stand clearly above everything else. The forensic component sits a very distant second. The other issue is that in a lot of cases, there may be no injuries or no injuries that you can ascribe to an assaultive event. And it's fascinating to me how difficult it is to explain to others or for them to accept. Here is a person who has been sexually assaulted. I've examined them. There are no injuries. The immediate thinking is, well, nothing happened. Or a lie is being told. Or wouldn't you expect serious injuries from this? And the answer is no. Most sexual assaults of adults do not result in injuries. And the injuries that might be seen may not necessarily be ascribed to the assaultive event. So explaining that to police, and particularly in days gone by, they were locked into the view no injuries equals no assault. I think we've stepped past that now. It needs a lot of education of including lawyers. And in the vast majority of children in whom there's allegations or very strong suspicions of sexual assault, there are no abnormal findings. Probably more than 95% of children who are sexually assaulted do not sustain an injury that can be seen at a later time. And the first hurdle then is to explain to, particularly for children, the parent, there are no injuries present. On one hand, fantastic news. But on the other hand, they very quickly move to a situation of saying, well, does that mean it didn't occur, or this is going to be a real challenge in the legal process? Because that important corroborative evidence is not there.
And how do you navigate the situations where the child can't articulate what has happened?
I don't see that as a major impediment. I mean, it's useful if an account is provided, but your findings are not going to change. Perversely, you could argue that when usually an adult's provide an account, you have to start from the viewpoint that, all right, that's one account, but there might be other accounts as well. Through no malice, something else might have happened. We get situations where perhaps self-inflicted injuries might masquerade as an assault, others because the individual is confused, agitated, upset that the account that they provide may not be exactly right. They're under the influence of alcohol or other drugs, which might also cause the account to vary a little bit. So it's important that although an account is always provided, that the opinion that follows isn't provided to fit that account. That's a very dangerous process.
Are there telltale pointers to a self-inflicted injury?
There may be. There are a lot of features that might be present in self-inflicted injuries. But in forensic medicine, it's very rare for there to be only one explanation of what you're seeing. So on one hand, you can see some injuries and you say, gosh, that's highly suggestive. It's got the 5 or the 10 features that you read about and you see in self-infliction.
And what are those telltale signs?
When it comes to physical injuries, it might be that they're clustered, that they're multiple in one spot. It might be on the neck or the leg or the abdomen, that they're of similar nature, probably been produced by the one implement, that they tend to avoid some of the vital structures like the eye, the mouth, the nipples, that they are of similar severity. And it goes on along that pathway. But always take the view that might there be another explanation as well. And I think in a report or in court, you have to, if you've got any doubt at all, you have to say, well, that's one explanation, self-infliction, but I can't exclude the following scenario. And I would also take the view that self-infliction in itself identifies an individual who is in need of some help. You don't go and damage yourself and then portray it as an assaultive event without there being some significant disrupted thinking, if you like, or trouble. Is this a call for help? And is this the right time and place to say to a person, I can help you, but it doesn't require the police and others? But I think the days of thinking that people falsely report, yes, we do get some isolated examples. They're very easy to work through, either at the police stage, the medical stage, or some other. But in days gone by, the number of children and women in particular who were blamed as false reports was frightening. And science didn't support it at all.
And with children and physical injuries, though, there are some definite signs, aren't there, like fingertip bruising? Could you explain some of those definite signs?
Well, I don't think fingertip bruising's one because I've been guilty of those, inflicting them on my own children. Let me give you an example. You're walking with your child, there's a busy road, the child makes a lurch towards the busy road and you grab their arm forcibly and grasp them and pull them back. That will leave some fingerprint imprints on the child's arm. Mm-hmm. Now, that wasn't done as a deliberate event. So there's a lot of little bits of the puzzle or process. So one might be with children, their developmental stage. So the argument might be they were running and they fell. Are they at a stage where they actually run? Are they at a stage where they might roll off the change table? They reached up to the bench and pulled down the electric kettle. Can they do that? What's their height? So there's lots of little jigsaw puzzles, if you like, that might be attained from the scene, from a child's developmental analysis, and from the pattern of injuries. And by the pattern, I mean the number of injuries, the type of injuries, the location of those injuries starts to build up a bit of a picture in your mind as to the circumstances under which they may have been sustained. And again, to get a single explanation is pretty rare.
Now, you've been openly critical of the way many of our institutions handle sexual assault and child abuse. What do you see are the biggest failings in our system?
Perhaps less so children, because a lot of those initial concerns I had, you remember I said at the start of my journey I was intrigued by the absence of the child cases going to court. I sat down and thought about this process of how is it that we ask children to come into a courtroom, but the structure is set up for adults. We ask them to give evidence, understand the meaning of telling the truth, all of those concepts that are foreign to children. And so in most of these cases, the court found that the child did not have the capacity to give evidence, understand the various things. It was extraordinarily confronting, both for the parent, child, and others around them. The system failed. The key element, I suppose, of looking at this is we've now evolved into giving evidence by video link and also videotaping the original account provided by the child, which is then provided. So reducing the need of the child to be in court and providing support for them at all these processes and getting specialist lawyers involved in cases involving children. So I think things have moved forward. They've got a little to go, but things are much better for that group of witnesses. When it comes to sexual violence cases, I've spent a lot of my life so frustrated with this process that we force people to go down a pathway if justice is going to be achieved. And it's just nonsense. I'll give you an example. A lot of the people I've seen over my professional life have an intellectual disability. I mean, people with intellectual disabilities, active psychiatric illnesses, are more likely to be victims of violent crime. They're vulnerable people out in the community. I have never given evidence in a case involving a person with an intellectual disability. Now, I find that extraordinary. Hundreds of people I've examined alleging, for instance, sexual assault, but I've never given evidence. Does that mean they've never got to court? Does it mean that the offenders have pleaded guilty? What does it mean? Now, I can understand the bar needing to be high. The evidence they give has the possibility of sending someone to jail for a long time. But let's stop pretending that we've got a system that is beneficial to the most vulnerable members of our community. It's inaccessible. So why do we continually play out this process of say, come and get examined, there will be a court case, the person will be held to account? That's rubbish. It doesn't happen. So if the system is set up to protect the most vulnerable, we need to acknowledge it doesn't. The second component is we have a system that is slow, is extraordinarily demanding, and has so many challenges that people would say, I don't want to be part of that. In my naivety, in my very early days, I couldn't understand this. Here is the justice system, Victoria, Australia, set up, but people don't use it. And I thought, what's wrong? So I just did a little poll survey. I asked people who worked in this field, 10 doctors or nurses who worked in the field of sexual violence. These were all female. 10 female police officers who worked in this area and 10 female lawyers. And the question was, if you were sexually assaulted by someone who knew you, because that's the majority of sexual assault cases, if you were sexually assaulted by someone who knew you, would you report it? 100% of them said no. Now, I found that extraordinary. These are people who actually work in this field, who go to work each day trying to convince people, come down this pathway, but they wouldn't do it themselves. Imagine if you're producing a product and you're trying to sell it to the public, but you said, I wouldn't touch it myself. that becomes farcical. It becomes illogical. It becomes immoral. So we have to find a better way, because if the people who know most about the system aren't prepared to use the product, we have to. I'll give you another little example. I was working in a Southern African nation doing some work around sexual violence, and I was trying to understand how these cases might be addressed in that country. I wasn't part of this case at all, but a young woman alleged that she'd been sexually assaulted by another man in her community. She went off and reported it to the elder. The elder sat her down and listened to her story. He then called in the young man and said, "Can you tell me what happened?" and listened to their story. And then called them both back. This was all within 48 hours, not 2 or 3 or 5 years' time. And he said to the young man, "You did wrong. I've listened to both of your stories. You did wrong. And your penalty is you must provide this young woman with 3 cattle." This was the currency. He was then obliged to give this young woman the 3 cattle. Case closed. The simplicity is stunning. The timeliness, very impressive. Yes, it's got weaknesses in that it's one person who may have a vested interest, but he is the oldest, wisest person in this group. And I'm told there are women involved in this process as well. It also is a very public acknowledgement that if you behave like this, you will be held to account. We don't have that. And there is a material gain for the victim. She has received cattle that will allow her livelihood to be improved. Here we have a system where effectively you report it, you become a small component of the evidence, nothing else. And there is not a reward's the right word, but a physical acknowledgement of the wrongdoing that assists that person. So I think we need to go back to the drawing board and rethink this through. And that rethinking shouldn't be done by lawyers or others. They can be part of it. But if we're there to just preserve the status quo, it's a little bit like wars on drugs. The key players are the people with a strong vested interest. They don't want the system to change. But the community, I think, are ready for material shift in this area because we haven't won it. So let's do that. And I would be very positive that by sitting down and thinking better ways through, and particularly for the vulnerable members of a community, we can find a better system and we could become world leaders in this.
It sounds like you'd be interested in restorative justice programs.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about introducing that into sexual assault, but only talk.
It's that. Look, I would keep a very open mind on any alternative because I personally think very quickly after a sexual assault is reporting, you could get some key elements. For instance, if 95% of sexual assaults are committed by someone known to the victim, why are we collecting forensic evidence? Why do we put a woman through an extensive physical examination, collect hundreds of samples, send them off to the lab? The lab spends long amounts of time. Why not just go out and pick up the bloke, because he's going to be around, he's known to the victim, and ask the question with the regular warnings, did you have intercourse with this woman? And if the answer is yes, and he's going to say it was with consent, forget about all the specimens. Forget about putting the woman through this. It comes down to one person's word against another. And we can treat it in a much more humane, adult fashion. Clearly, that pathway doesn't get followed if it's an unknown offender or if the victim sustains multiple injuries, because that tends to go against consenting, and you can go down that pathway. But that would be the vast majority addressed, and this might be a place for that restorative justice model.
David, you spent decades doing work that involves looking at the worst aspects of people. Your work has brought you moments of hope. Could you tell us about some of those?
I'll acknowledge we're a terrible species. Our behaviours just defy description. But if you work in a field for which you are despairing, pessimistic, then probably your contributions are over. you have to take the view of being optimistic that there is hope. And how do we get to point X? Because if there is no point X, we're all wasting our time. It's a little bit like that group I looked at with sexual assault. Why do you work in a field for which you have no faith in? So on one hand, we acknowledge we're a very poor species, and a lot of our decision-making involving other members of our race is fundamentally flawed, destructive, vindictive, and all of those other things. The other part is, if you look for processes that might improve our knowledge, our experience, our interventions, chances are you can make little improvements. In these situations, you see the best and the worst of human behaviours. The worst will always be around in some form or another, but how do we harness those best approaches and make them an integral part of improving the system? The system's flawed. We all have the capacity, and particularly those that are starting this journey, are inheriting a very different process than occurred 20-odd years ago. I think there's been some massive improvements in service delivery, particularly to victims, and particularly to victims of sexual violence, counselling services, the health services. To children, a greater willingness to understand that injuries or allegations are worth progressing. These are major public health positive outcomes. And then there are the personal ones. This field of medicine doesn't allow you to follow up on your patients for very long. You don't get Christmas cards. You don't get the thanks. I'll give you a small example. A young girl I saw when she was 10 years of age, a long time ago, had made allegations of sexual abuse by her, a little bit unusually, her biological father. I examined her, I wrote a report, I gave evidence in court. The prosecutor came to my office and said, look, this whole case is going to collapse because the victim, a 10-year-old girl, is in the witness box and she can't stop sobbing. And the magistrate said, unless you tell me or answer my questions, I'm going to dismiss this case. So I said to the prosecutor, look, let me just sit with her for a few minutes and talk with her. And I said to her at the time, look, I can't talk about the case, but I'm going to come into the courtroom and I'm going to sit in the front row. Don't look at your father. Don't look at the lawyers or the magistrate. Just look at me and pretend that the two of us are just talking. I'm not going to nod. I'm not going to encourage you, but just look at me and give the answers to me. For some reason it worked, and he was convicted and got a lengthy jail term. Now, her life unravelled completely. She blamed herself for destroying the family. She was blamed by others for this process. But over the next decade or so, I saw her repeatedly either with significant acts of self-harm, substance abuse, and prostitution as a young teenager. And I was of the thinking of this time, this young girl will never see old bones. Maybe you just cut her free. But I saw her, I remember certifying her into hospital repeatedly, and she hated me and would scream and yell, other things. But we've stayed in contact. She's now the mother of two children well into their 20s who have both been extraordinarily successful in their own right. Her life is still extraordinarily bumpy and confronting. But it taught me, and I should have been sensitive to this in the past, you just don't give up on people, particularly children. There is a process that almost inevitably has been created for them, but there is some internal ingenuity, strength, capacity to try and get yourself out of that hole. And if we make services available, accessible, then maybe we can save a lot of these people from going down a pathway of complete self-destruction. It's not easy, but it reinforces that process of how damaging many of these behaviours are. And there's many cases where I would be first to admit I've learnt a lot more from a case than I've perhaps contributed to those individuals' lives.
Well, you've learnt a lot more, but then you've passed that learning on in your next cases. Look, thank you so much, David. It's been so interesting.
Thank you, Liz.
Crime Insiders Forensics is hosted by me, Liz Porter. It's produced by Holly Mitchell, Jade Murray and Dan Mullins. Sound design is by Niall Fernandez. This podcast is produced on Wurundjeri and Gadigal lands.